I never thought moving into a gated community in Scottsdale, Arizona would turn me into a constitutional crusader, but the universe has a funny way of aligning your skills with exactly where they're needed most. My name is Simon Lancaster, and I've spent the last 15 years as a First Amendment attorney, defending everyone from journalists to protesters to students who got suspended for wearing controversial T-shirts. I'd just wrapped up a massive case in Chicago involving a city ordinance that restricted public assembly, and I was exhausted. My wife had passed away 2 years earlier, and my daughter was studying abroad in Spain. The big house in Illinois felt empty, so when a colleague mentioned his sister was selling a place in Scottsdale, I jumped at it. Desert air, sunshine, and quiet seemed like exactly what I needed. The house was perfect. A beautiful Spanish-style villa with terracotta tiles, a pool in the backyard, and mountain views that made you feel like you were in a painting. The neighborhood, Saguaro Heights, was pristine. Every lawn was manicured to identical perfection, every house painted in approved desert tones. The realtor had mentioned it was an HOA community, but I'd brushed it off. How bad could it be? I closed on the property on a Tuesday in late October 2025, right in the thick of local election season. The next morning, I was unloading boxes from the moving truck when I noticed something odd. Every single house on my street was completely bare of any political messaging. No yard signs, no banners, no flags except for American flags. In Chicago, election season meant every other house had a sign supporting someone for something. Here, nothing. I didn't think much of it until I tried to put up my own sign, not because I was particularly passionate about the local school board race, but because my former colleague's daughter was running, and I'd promised to show support. It was a simple thing. Elect Jennifer Morrison, School Board District 3. I'd barely gotten the wire stakes into the ground when a silver Lexus SUV pulled up to my curb. A woman in her mid-50s emerged, wearing pristine white capri pants and a turquoise blouse that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her blonde hair was cut in that aggressive bob that screams, "I want to speak to the manager," and her expression suggested she'd just discovered someone had parked in her designated spot. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice saccharine sweet in that way that meant trouble. "You must be new here. I'm Deborah Mitchell, president of the Saguaro Heights Homeowners Association." I straightened up and wiped my hands on my jeans. "Simon Lancaster, just moved in yesterday. Welcome to the neighborhood." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news on your second day, but that sign is going to have to come down." I glanced at the little sign stuck in my front lawn. "I'm sorry, what?" "Political signs are strictly prohibited in Saguaro Heights. It's in the CC and Rs that you signed when you purchased the property." She said this like she was explaining basic arithmetic to a child. "I reviewed the CC and Rs pretty carefully," I said, which was true. "Occupational hazard." "I don't recall seeing anything about political signs." Deborah's smile tightened. "Well, it was added in an amendment passed by the board 6 months ago. We had some very divisive signage during the last election cycle, and it created tension among neighbors. The board decided unanimously that banning all political signs would maintain harmony in our community." Something in my chest tightened. It wasn't anger, exactly. More like the feeling a bloodhound gets when it catches a scent. "Did the amendment require a vote from the homeowners?" "The board has full authority to amend community standards," Deborah said, her voice cooling several degrees. "Now, I'm going to give you until 5 p.m. today to remove that sign, as a courtesy since you're new. After that, you'll be fined $50 per day until it's removed." She turned on her heel and walked back to her Lexus before I could respond. I watched her drive away, then looked down at the innocent little sign supporting a school board candidate. Most people would have probably pulled it up. $50 a day adds up fast, and who wants to start a war with their HOA in the first 48 hours? But I wasn't most people. I was a constitutional attorney who'd just been told I couldn't engage in core political speech on my own property. I left the sign exactly where it was and went inside to start unpacking my law books. By that evening, I'd found my copy of the Saguaro Heights CC and Rs and every amendment that had been filed with the county. Sure enough, 6 months ago, the board had passed Amendment 47B, which stated, No political signs, banners, flags, or other displays of political messaging shall be permitted on any property within Saguaro Heights. This includes, but is not limited to, signs supporting candidates, ballot measures, political parties, or political movements. Violations will result in fines of $50 per day. I read it 3 times, feeling that familiar itch I got when I saw government overreach. Except this wasn't technically government, it was a private HOA. But the principle was the same. They were restricting speech and doing it in a ham-fisted way that almost certainly violated Arizona law. I spent the next 2 days researching. Arizona has some of the strongest protections for political speech in the country, especially when it comes to HOAs. Arizona Revised Statutes. Section 33, 1808 is crystal clear. HOA. As cannot prohibit the outdoor display of political signs, they can impose reasonable regulations about size, number, and duration, but an outright ban? That's illegal. The problem was that most homeowners don't know this. They get a threatening letter from their HOA, they panic, they comply. The HOA counts on that ignorance. On Friday morning, I got my first official notice. It was slid under my door in a crisp white envelope with the Saguaro Heights HOA logo embossed on the front. Inside was a letter informing me that I was in violation of Amendment 47B and had accrued 3 days of fines totaling $150. I had 24 hours to remove the sign, or the fines would continue to accumulate, and after 30 days of non-compliance, the HOA could place a lien on my property. I sat at my kitchen table, coffee in hand, reading the letter. Then I opened my laptop and started drafting. By Monday morning, I'd prepared a comprehensive lawsuit against the Saguaro Heights Homeowners Association. The complaint was 23 pages long and cited Arizona statute, case law, and the First Amendment principles that had been affirmed by courts across the country. I was suing for declaratory relief, asking the court to strike down Amendment 47B as illegal, and I was seeking an injunction to prevent the HOA from enforcing it against any homeowner. I also included a claim for attorney's fees. Under Arizona law, if an HOA loses a lawsuit because they violated state statute, they have to pay the homeowner's legal costs. Since I was representing myself, those fees would theoretically be calculated based on my hourly rate, which was substantial. This wasn't about money, but I wanted the HOA to understand that their illegal rule was going to cost them dearly. I filed the lawsuit on Monday morning at the Maricopa County Superior Court. By Monday afternoon, I'd arranged for service of process. A process server showed up at Deborah Mitchell's house at 4 p.m. and handed her the summons and complaint. I have to admit, I wished I could have seen her face. Tuesday morning, my doorbell rang at 7:30 a.m. I was still in my pajama pants and a t-shirt, drinking coffee and reviewing some emails from my old firm. I opened the door to find Deborah Mitchell flanked by 2 other people, a man in his 60s wearing golf attire and a younger woman in a business suit carrying a leather portfolio. "Mr. Lancaster," Deborah said, her voice dripping with venom, "I think we need to talk." "Good morning, Deborah," I said pleasantly. "And you are?" I directed this at her companions. The man in golf clothes puffed up his chest. "Harold Jenkins, HOA treasurer, and this is Rebecca Morrison, our attorney." I noticed Rebecca Morrison's jaw was tight. She knew exactly what kind of trouble they were in. "I'd invite you in, but I'm not really dressed for company," I said. "What can I do for you?" "You can drop this ridiculous lawsuit," Deborah snapped. "You've been in this neighborhood for 1 week, and you're already causing problems, stirring up trouble, making us look bad." "I'm not making you look bad," I said calmly. "Your illegal rules are making you look bad. I'm just pointing it out." Rebecca Morrison cleared her throat. "Mr. Lancaster, I've reviewed your complaint. While I understand your concerns, I think this is something we can resolve without litigation. Perhaps if we sat down and discussed some compromise regarding the signage rules." "There's nothing to compromise about," I said. "Arizona law is clear. HOAs cannot ban political signs, period. You can regulate them, but you cannot ban them. Your Amendment 47B is illegal, and you need to rescind it." "That's not going to happen," Deborah said. The board voted unanimously on this. Our residents don't want their neighborhood turned into a political battleground. What your residents want doesn't matter if it violates state law, I said. I was still being polite, but my patience was wearing thin. You don't get to vote away statutory rights. Harold Jenkins stepped forward. Now listen here. We've spent years cultivating the image of this community. Property values here are among the highest in Scottsdale precisely because we maintain standards. If we let everyone put up whatever signs they want, this place will look like a carnival. Arizona law allows HOAs to impose reasonable restrictions on size, number, and timing, I explained. You could require that signs be no larger than 3 feet by 2 feet. You could limit homeowners to 2 signs maximum. You could require that they be removed within a week after the election. Those would all be legal. But you chose to do a blanket ban, which is lazy and illegal. Rebecca Morrison's expression suggested she agreed with me, but couldn't say so in front of her clients. Mr. Lancaster, if we agreed to amend the rule to impose reasonable restrictions instead of a ban, would you consider dropping the lawsuit? No, I said simply, because you also need to refund every fine you've collected under the illegal rule, and you need to publicly notify all residents that the previous rule was unlawful. Plus, frankly, I think the community deserves to see this play out in court. Other HOAs in Arizona need to understand that they can't just steamroll over state law because they find political speech inconvenient. Deborah's face was turning an alarming shade of red. You smug son of a... Deborah, Rebecca Morrison cut her off sharply. Let's go. We'll respond through proper legal channels. The three of them left, Deborah practically vibrating with fury. I closed the door and went back to my coffee, feeling more energized than I had in months. Over the next week, things escalated quickly. The HOA filed their response to my lawsuit, claiming that Amendment 47B was a reasonable restriction necessary to maintain property values and community aesthetics. Their argument was that political signs were inherently divisive and that the ban applied equally to all political viewpoints. Therefore, it wasn't discriminatory. It was a terrible argument. Arizona courts had already rejected virtually identical reasoning in previous cases. But I guess they had to try something. What was more interesting was what started happening in the neighborhood. Other residents began hearing about the lawsuit. I'd been careful to name only the HOA as a defendant, not any individual board members, but word spread fast in a community like Saguaro Heights. On Thursday afternoon, a man in his early 40s knocked on my door. He introduced himself as Marcus Chen, and he lived 3 streets over. I just wanted to say thank you, Marcus said. I'm running for city council, and when I tried to put up a sign in my own yard last year, the HOA fined me $2,000. I ended up just paying it because I couldn't afford to fight them. They stole $2,000 from you for exercising your right to political speech, I said, feeling anger rise in my chest. Did you know the rule was illegal? I suspected it might be. But their lawyer sent me this letter saying that CC and Rs are binding contracts and that I'd agreed to them when I bought the house. I didn't know what to do. Marcus looked frustrated with himself. I should have fought it. You were in an impossible position, I said. That's what they count on. But here's the thing. You might be able to get that money back. If the court strikes down the rule, you could file a separate action for restitution. Marcus's eyes widened. Really? I can't promise anything, but it's worth trying. Do you have documentation of the fines? Every email, every letter, every receipt for the payments. Good. Hold on to all of that. Let's see how my case plays out first. After Marcus left, I started wondering how many other people the HOA had shaken down over this illegal rule. If they'd been enforcing it for 6 months, and if even a handful of people had dared to put up political signs, the fines could have added up to tens of thousands of dollars. That evening, I took a walk around the neighborhood. It was a beautiful November evening, the temperature finally dropping into the 70s after a hot day. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Saguaro Heights really was gorgeous, I had to admit. As I walked, I paid attention to the houses. Everything was immaculate. No peeling paint, no overgrown lawns, no cars parked on the street overnight. It was the kind of neighborhood where everything looked perfect in a slightly unsettling way, like a movie set. I turned a corner and nearly bumped into a woman walking a small dog. She was in her 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing running clothes. "Sorry," I said, stepping aside. "No problem." She smiled, then paused. "Wait, are you the guy who sued the HOA?" "Word travels fast," I said. "Are you kidding? It's all anyone's talking about. I'm Bethany Jordan, by the way. I live over on Cactus Lane." "Simon Lancaster, nice to meet you." "Listen," Bethany said, lowering her voice even though we were alone on the street. "A bunch of us have been wanting to fight back against the HOA for years, but nobody had the guts. Deborah and her cronies run this place like a fiefdom. Do you know they fined my neighbor $300 because her mailbox post was the wrong shade of brown?" "You're joking." "I wish I was. They have this approved color palette, and her mailbox was desert tan instead of adobe tan. She had to repaint it and pay the fines." Bethany shook her head. "The political sign thing was just the latest power trip. A lot of people wanted to show support for candidates, but they were too scared of the fines." "How many people on the board?" I asked. 5. Deborah Mitchell is president. Harold Jenkins is treasurer. Then there's Patricia Whitmore, Linda Sanchez, and Gregory Hoffman. They've all been on the board for at least 4 years. They basically run unopposed every year because nobody else wants to deal with it." "When's the next HOA meeting?" 2 weeks, second Tuesday of every month, 7 p.m. at the clubhouse. They're supposedly open meetings, but Deborah doesn't like it when people actually show up." I smiled. "I think I'll attend." "Oh, this is going to be good," Bethany said, grinning. "Let me know if you need anything. Seriously, a lot of us are rooting for you." As I walked back to my house, I started formulating a plan. The lawsuit was the legal avenue, but there was also a political one. If enough homeowners were unhappy with the current board, they could vote them out and install new leadership that would actually follow the law. The next morning, I got a call from Rebecca Morrison, the HOA's attorney. "Mr. Lancaster, I'd like to make one more attempt at settlement before this goes any further," she said. Her voice was professional, but tired. "I'm listening." "My clients are willing to amend Amendment 47B to allow political signs with reasonable restrictions. No larger than 4 square feet, no more than 2 per property, must be removed within 2 weeks after the election. They'll publicly post the new rule and notify all residents. They'll also waive all fines currently pending, including yours." "What about refunds for fines already paid?" There was a pause. "They're not willing to do that." "Then we don't have a deal. Rebecca, you know as well as I do that they violated Arizona law. People like Marcus Chen paid thousands of dollars in illegal fines. The HOA doesn't get to just say, 'Oops, our bad,' and keep the money." "Mr. Lancaster, be reasonable. If you push this, the legal fees alone could bankrupt the HOA. That affects every homeowner in Saguaro Heights, including you." "Then perhaps the board should have considered that before they passed an illegal rule," I said. "I'm not trying to be difficult, but this is about principle. HOAs don't get to operate above the law just because they're private organizations. If the board members were acting in good faith, they would have consulted with you before passing Amendment 47B, did they?" Another pause, longer this time. "No, they presented it to me after it had already been voted on." "And what did you tell them?" "I told them it was legally questionable and that they should reconsider." "And they ignored you?" "Yes." "Then they made their choice. I'm sorry you're stuck cleaning up their mess, but the answer is no. See you in court." I hung up, feeling only slightly guilty. Rebecca Morrison seemed like a decent attorney trapped with terrible clients, but that wasn't my problem. The weekend passed quietly. I spent Saturday assembling furniture and Sunday exploring Scottsdale. It really was a beautiful city, and I could see myself being happy here, assuming I didn't get run out of town by an angry HOA board. Monday brought another surprise. I opened my front door to get the newspaper and found that someone had egged my house overnight. White and yellow streaks ran down my front door and the adjacent wall. The desert sun had already started baking it on. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the mess. Then I pulled out my phone and took pictures from multiple angles. After that, I called the Scottsdale Police Department. The officer who responded was a young guy named Officer Martinez. He took a report and examined the damage. "Any idea who might have done this?" he asked. "I'm in a legal dispute with my HOA," I said. "I filed a lawsuit last week. Could be related, could be random vandalism." HOA dispute, huh? Officer Martinez looked sympathetic. My parents dealt with one of those. Total nightmare. You got security cameras? Not yet, but I'm installing them today. Good idea. Probably not much we can do unless you can identify who did it, but I'll file the report. If it happens again, definitely call us. After he left, I spent 3 hours cleaning egg off my house, then another 2 hours installing a Ring doorbell camera and 2 additional cameras covering my front and back yards. If someone wanted to escalate things, I was going to have evidence. That afternoon, I got an email from Deborah Mitchell. It was CC'd to the entire HOA board and Rebecca Morrison. Dear Mr. Lancaster, it has come to the board's attention that you are in violation of multiple community standards beyond the political signage issue. Your garage door was left open past 10 p.m. on November 7th, violating Section 12.4 of the CC&Rs. Your trash cans were visible from the street on November 9th, a non-collection day, violating Section 8.2. You have failed to maintain your front lawn to community standards with several weeds visible in the rock garden area, violating Section 3.1. Fines for these violations total $450. Please remit payment within 10 days or additional penalties will accrue. I read the email twice, then actually laughed out loud. They were retaliating. This was the HOA equivalent of throwing a tantrum. I forwarded the email to myself with a note. Evidence of retaliation. Then I sent a response, also CCing everyone. Dear Ms. Mitchell and HOA Board, thank you for your email detailing alleged violations. I note with interest that I have resided in Saguaro Heights for less than 2 weeks, yet you have apparently been monitoring my property with unusual intensity. The timing of these alleged violations, coming immediately after I filed a lawsuit challenging an illegal HOA rule, suggests retaliation rather than good faith enforcement of community standards. I will not be paying these fines. If you choose to pursue this matter, I will be amending my lawsuit to include claims of harassment and retaliation. I look forward to presenting this email to a judge as evidence of your vindictive conduct. Regards, Simon Lancaster. My phone rang 30 seconds after I hit send. It was Rebecca Morrison. Mr. Lancaster, please tell me you're not going to amend your complaint. That depends on whether your clients back off, I said. This is obviously retaliation. You know it, I know it, and a judge will know it. I advised them not to send that email. I'm sure you did. But they don't listen to you, do they? Rebecca Morrison sighed. No, they don't. Then maybe it's time you considered whether you want to keep representing them. This is only going to get worse. She didn't respond to that, and we ended the call. The next week was relatively quiet. I continued settling into my house, started taking on some remote consulting work for my old firm, and prepared for the upcoming court hearing. The HOA had filed a motion to dismiss my case, arguing that I lacked standing because I hadn't exhausted internal remedies. That is, I hadn't appealed to the board before filing suit. It was another terrible argument. Arizona law doesn't require homeowners to exhaust internal remedies when challenging rules that are facially invalid under state statute. But it gave us a reason to appear before a judge, which was fine by me. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late November. I arrived at the Maricopa County Superior Court at 8:30 a.m., dressed in my best suit. Rebecca Morrison was there with Harold Jenkins and Deborah Mitchell. Deborah looked like she'd rather be anywhere else on earth. We were assigned to Judge Patricia Winters, a woman in her 50s with a reputation for being sharp and no nonsense. I'd done my research on her. She'd ruled against HOAs in several previous cases, which I took as a positive sign. The hearing started promptly at 9. Rebecca Morrison argued first, contending that I should have followed the HOA's internal dispute resolution process before resorting to litigation. Judge Winters listened patiently, then turned to me. Mr. Lancaster, you're representing yourself, I see? Yes, Your Honor. Go ahead. I stood and launched into my argument. Your Honor, Arizona Revised Statute Section 33, 1808 explicitly prohibits HOAs from banning political signs. The statute allows for reasonable restrictions on size, number, and timing, but a complete ban is facially invalid. When a rule is invalid on its face under state statute, Arizona law does not require a homeowner to exhaust internal remedies. That requirement applies only to disputes over application or interpretation of valid rules. Here, there's nothing to interpret. The rule is simply illegal. Judge Winters looked at Rebecca Morrison. Counsel, is there any case law supporting the proposition that Mr. Lancaster needed to exhaust internal remedies in this situation? Your Honor, the general principle is that I'm asking for case law, not general principles. Rebecca Morrison hesitated. Not directly on point, Your Honor, but then your motion is denied. Judge Winters made a note on her tablet. Let's talk about the merits. Ms. Morrison, defend this rule. Explain to me how a blanket ban on political signs is consistent with Arizona Revised Statute Section 33, 1808. Your Honor, the rule applies equally to all political viewpoints. It's not viewpoint discriminatory. The HOA has a legitimate interest in maintaining community aesthetics and preventing neighbor disputes. Ms. Morrison, I've read Section 33, 1808. It says, and I quote, "An association shall not prohibit the outdoor display of political signs." That seems pretty unambiguous to me. Where's the wiggle room you're trying to find? Your Honor, the statute allows for reasonable restrictions. Reasonable restrictions? Yes, not outright bans. A reasonable restriction would be limiting the size or number of signs. Your clients banned them entirely. How is that not a direct violation of the statute? Rebecca Morrison was clearly struggling. Your Honor, the association believes that any political signage would be detrimental to the community. I don't care what the association believes. I care what the statute says. Judge Winters turned to me. Mr. Lancaster, what relief are you seeking? Your Honor, I'm asking the court to declare Amendment 47B invalid and unenforceable. I'm also asking for an injunction prohibiting the HOA from enforcing it against any homeowner. Finally, I'm seeking attorney's fees under Arizona Revised Statute Section 33, 1808, which provides for fee shifting when an HOA violates its provisions. You're representing yourself. How do attorney's fees work in that situation? Your Honor, courts in Arizona have held that pro se attorneys are entitled to fees based on their standard hourly rate to prevent HOAs from escaping financial consequences simply because the homeowner happens to be a lawyer. Judge Winters smiled slightly. That's a bit self-serving, don't you think? Perhaps, Your Honor, but it's also the law. Fair enough. She looked at both parties. Here's my ruling. Mr. Lancaster's motion for summary judgment is granted. Amendment 47B is declared invalid and unenforceable under Arizona Revised Statutes, Section 33, 1808. The HOA is permanently enjoined from enforcing it. Mr. Lancaster, prepare a proposed order on attorney's fees. Include your hourly rate and time records. Ms. Morrison, you'll have an opportunity to object. Anything else? Your Honor, I said, there's the matter of refunds for fines already collected. That's not part of your complaint. I can amend it, Judge Winters considered. Ms. Morrison, how much has the HOA collected in fines under this rule? Rebecca Morrison looked at Harold Jenkins, who muttered something. She turned back to the judge. Approximately $12,000, Your Honor. $12,000 in 6 months. Judge Winters shook her head. Ms. Morrison, I strongly suggest your clients refund every penny. If Mr. Lancaster amends his complaint and brings this back before me, I'm going to be significantly less patient. Yes, Your Honor. We're adjourned. I packed up my briefcase, trying not to grin too widely. Across the courtroom, Deborah Mitchell looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca Morrison caught up with me. Congratulations, she said, and she actually sounded sincere. Thank you. For what it's worth, you did the best you could with a bad case. I'll communicate the judge's recommendation about the refunds. I can't promise they'll agree. If they don't, I'll be back in court next week with an amended complaint, and this time I might add some individual board members as defendants for acting in bad faith. Rebecca Morrison nodded. I'll make that clear to them. As I walked to my car, my phone started buzzing with text messages. Apparently, word of the hearing results had spread fast. Bethany Jordan sent me a string of celebration emojis. Marcus Chen asked if this meant he'd get his $2,000 back. Even people I hadn't met were reaching out, thanking me for standing up to the HOA. When I got home, I found a bottle of wine on my doorstep with a note. "Thank you for fighting the good fight. From your grateful neighbors." That evening, I drafted a proposed order on attorney's fees. I'd kept meticulous time records, and I'd spent about 40 hours on the case so far between research, drafting, and court appearances. My standard rate was $450 per hour. I submitted a request for $18,000. I knew the HOA would object. They'd argue I'd spent too much time, or that my rate was too high, or whatever else they could think of. But Judge Winters had seemed inclined to make this expensive for them, and I was happy to oblige. The week passed, and I received notification that the HOA board had scheduled an emergency meeting. It wasn't on the normal calendar, which was suspicious. I decided to show up anyway. The meeting was on a Thursday evening at 7 p.m. I arrived at the clubhouse to find about 30 other residents already there, which was apparently 10 times the normal attendance. Deborah Mitchell looked like she was about to have a stroke when she saw me walk in. "This is a closed board meeting," she said immediately. "Arizona law says HOA meetings have to be open to all members," I replied calmly, taking a seat in the back row. Several other residents murmured agreement. Deborah looked at Rebecca Morrison, who shook her head slightly. "He's right." "Fine," Deborah said through gritted teeth. "Everyone sit down and be quiet. The board has business to discuss." The meeting was supposed to be about reviewing recent legal developments, which was code for figuring out how to respond to getting destroyed in court. Harold Jenkins, the treasurer, presented a financial report showing that defending the lawsuit had already cost the HOA $8,000 in legal fees, and that was before the attorney's fees award I was seeking. "If we have to pay Mr. Lancaster's fees and refund all the fines, we're looking at a total hit of about $40,000, Harold said glumly. "That's a significant portion of our annual budget." "Maybe you shouldn't have passed an illegal rule," someone called out from the audience. Several people laughed. Deborah's face turned red. "The board acted in good faith to maintain community standards." "The board acted like tyrants," Bethany Jordan stood up. "You've been using fines as a weapon to control everyone in this neighborhood. The political sign thing is just the most obvious example." "Sit down, Mrs. Jordan. You're out of order." "No, I don't think I will." Bethany crossed her arms. "I want to know how many other illegal rules you've been enforcing. Because if the political sign ban was illegal, what else have you been doing that violates Arizona law?" This caused an uproar. Multiple residents started shouting questions. Deborah banged a gavel, demanding order, but nobody was listening anymore. I sat in the back, watching the chaos with interest. This was what happened when people who'd been bullied finally realized the bully wasn't as powerful as they seemed. Eventually, the meeting dissolved into chaos. Deborah adjourned it early and everyone filed out, still arguing and discussing. Bethany came up to me, eyes shining. "That was amazing," she said. "I've never seen anyone stand up to them like that." "Technically, I didn't say anything. That was all you." "Yeah, but you showed us it was possible to fight back." She lowered her voice. "A bunch of us are talking about mounting a challenge in the next board election. We could get enough votes to replace at least 3 of them." "When's the election?" "March. We'd need to get nominations in by January." "I might be interested in running," I said, "or at least supporting people who will." Over the next few weeks, things continued to develop. The HOA board, on Rebecca Morrison's strong advice, agreed to refund all fines collected under Amendment 47B. Checks started going out to residents who'd been penalized. Marcus Chen got his $2,000 back, plus interest. The HOA also paid my attorney's fees. Judge Winters had reduced my request slightly, finding that some of my time entries were excessive, but she still awarded me $14,000. The check arrived with a letter from Harold Jenkins that was so passive-aggressive it was almost funny. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was transforming. Now that political signs were legal again, they started popping up everywhere. School board candidates, city council races, even some signs supporting state and federal candidates. It turned out a lot of people in Saguaro Heights had political opinions they'd been forced to hide. Deborah Mitchell retaliated in the pettiest ways possible. She started enforcing every minor rule in the CC&Rs with obsessive precision. People got fined for leaving their garbage cans out 10 minutes too long, for having a front door wreath that was too large, for parking a car with a small dent in the driveway overnight. It backfired spectacularly. Instead of intimidating residents, it just made them angrier. By December, there was a full-blown revolt brewing. A group of homeowners led by Bethany Jordan and Marcus Chen formed a coalition to run for the board. They called themselves Residents for Reasonable Governance, and their platform was simple: follow the law, respect homeowners' rights, and stop using fines as a weapon. I agreed to run as well for the treasurer position. Harold Jenkins had held that seat for 6 years, and it was time for someone with actual financial oversight experience to review the HOA's books. The campaign was contentious. Deborah and her allies sent out multiple emails warning that the rebel candidates would destroy property values and turn Saguaro Heights into chaos. They claimed that without strict enforcement, the neighborhood would fall apart. But most residents weren't buying it. They'd seen that you could have reasonable rules without tyranny. They were tired of living in fear of their own HOA. The election was held at the annual meeting in March. Nearly every homeowner showed up, either in person or by proxy. It was the highest turnout in Saguaro Heights history. When the votes were counted, Bethany Jordan had won the president position by a landslide. Marcus Chen was elected vice president. I won the treasurer seat. 2 other reform candidates took the remaining board positions. Deborah Mitchell, Harold Jenkins, and the rest of the old guard were out. Deborah didn't take it well. She stood up during the meeting and delivered a bitter speech about how the neighborhood would regret this decision, how property values would plummet, how we were destroying everything she'd worked to build. "You've built a dictatorship," Bethany said calmly from the front of the room. "We're replacing it with democracy." After Deborah stormed out, we got to work. Our first act as the new board was to review every rule and regulation the previous board had passed. We found multiple provisions that were legally questionable or outright illegal. Over the next 3 months, we systematically amended or rescinded them. We also instituted new transparency measures. All board meetings would be recorded and posted online. All financial records would be available for homeowner review. And most importantly, we created a formal process for challenging HOA decisions with clear appeals procedures and protections against retaliation. As treasurer, I discovered some concerning things in the HOA's financial records. Harold Jenkins hadn't been embezzling, exactly, but he'd been sloppy to the point of negligence. Money was going to vendors without proper documentation. There were payments to a consulting firm that turned out to be owned by his son-in-law. Nothing criminal, but definitely improper. I compiled a report and presented it to the board. We decided not to pursue legal action against Harold, mostly because it would be expensive, and the amounts involved weren't huge. But we did implement new financial controls to prevent future problems. By summer, Saguaro Heights was a different place. It was still beautiful, still well-maintained, but it no longer felt oppressive. People actually talked to each other. There were neighborhood barbecues. Kids played in the streets without their parents worrying about HOA violations for chalk drawings on the sidewalk. I settled into my routine. I took on more consulting work, enough to keep me busy but not overwhelmed. I made friends with my neighbors. I even started dating someone I met at a local coffee shop, though that's a different story. One evening in July, about 8 months after I'd first moved in, I was sitting by my pool watching the sunset when my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Deborah Mitchell standing there. "Deborah," I said, surprised, "what can I do for you?" She looked older than I remembered. Tired. "I wanted to apologize," she said quietly. "I hadn't expected that." "Come in." We sat in my living room. Deborah perched on the edge of the couch, looking uncomfortable. "I was wrong," she said, "about the political signs, about the way I ran the HOA, about all of it. I convinced myself I was protecting the neighborhood, maintaining standards, keeping property values high. But really, I was just controlling things because I could, because it made me feel important." "That takes courage to admit," I said. "My husband left me last month," she continued. "Said he was tired of living with someone who treated everyone like an enemy. My kids barely talk to me. And I realized that I've spent the last 6 years making everyone around me miserable, including myself." I'm sorry you're going through that. I don't deserve sympathy. Deborah wiped her eyes. I was a bully. I used the HOA as a weapon because I had nothing else in my life. You standing up to me getting voted out, it was humiliating. But it was also necessary. I needed to lose. We talked for about an hour. I'm not sure we became friends exactly, but we reached an understanding. Deborah was dealing with her own issues, working with a therapist, trying to rebuild relationships with her family. She'd even gotten a part-time job, which she said was helping her feel less isolated. After she left, I sat by the pool again, thinking about how strange life could be. I'd moved to Scottsdale looking for peace and quiet, and instead, I'd ended up leading a revolution against my HOA. But in the process, I'd found a community. I'd found purpose, and I'd remembered why I became a constitutional attorney in the first place. Because rights matter, even small ones, even in contexts like HOA, disputes that seem trivial compared to major civil liberties cases. The next morning, I was having breakfast when Bethany called. "Simon, we've got a situation," she said. "Remember that rule about approved paint colors?" "Yeah?" "Someone 3 streets over painted their house bright purple, like really purple. Deborah would have had a heart attack. What do we do?" I laughed. "Is it actually a violation of any law or just the aesthetic standards?" "Just aesthetic." "Then we send them a polite letter explaining that while they have every right to paint their house purple, it's outside the approved color palette, and would they be willing to choose something from the approved list? We don't fine them, we don't threaten them, we just ask. And if they say no, then we live with a purple house. It's not the end of the world." Bethany sighed. "I miss the days when being on the HOA board meant you could just tell people what to do." "No, you don't." "No, I don't," she agreed, laughing. "Okay, I'll send the letter." As it turned out, the purple house owner was receptive to the request and agreed to repaint in a more subdued tone. Crisis averted without fines, without threats, without drama. That became the model for how we ran the HOA. We enforced rules when necessary, but with common sense and proportionality. We treated residents like adults who deserved respect. And amazingly, the neighborhood didn't collapse into chaos. If anything, it improved. Property values actually went up, not because of strict enforcement, but because people wanted to live in a community that wasn't run by petty tyrants. Saguaro Heights developed a reputation as a well-managed HOA, which was apparently rare enough to be a selling point. I served on the board for 2 years before deciding not to run again. I'd accomplished what I needed to, and I wanted to focus more on my consulting work and personal life. Bethany and Marcus continued on, joined by other good people who understood that leadership was about service, not power. Years later, I still live in that house in Saguaro Heights. The political sign that started everything is long gone, but every election season, my yard and dozens of others sprout signs supporting various candidates. Some neighbors support Democrats, some support Republicans, some support third parties. We don't always agree, but we respect each other's right to express our views. And every time I see those signs, I smile, because they represent something important. The idea that even in a private community, even in the context of an HOA, fundamental rights still matter. The First Amendment doesn't stop at your property line. Political speech is protected not because it's convenient or pleasant or aesthetically pleasing, but because it's essential to democracy. I never expected to become the guy who sued his HOA over a sign, but I'm glad I did. Sometimes the smallest battles are the ones most worth fighting, not because they're small, but because they're about principle. And principles, once surrendered, are hard to reclaim. Deborah Mitchell ended up moving out of Saguaro Heights about a year after our conversation. I heard she relocated to Tucson and was doing better, working as a paralegal and volunteering at a community center. I hoped she'd found some peace. As for me, I found something I hadn't expected when I moved to Arizona, a home. Not just a house, but a real community where I felt connected to my neighbors, where I could make a difference, where I could use my skills to protect rights that mattered. All because someone tried to tell me I couldn't put up a simple political sign in my own yard. Funny how things work out. The Purple House, by the way, became a neighborhood landmark. The owner eventually did repaint it, but she chose a lovely shade of terracotta with turquoise accents that was technically within the approved palette, but still distinctly her own style. It became one of the most photographed houses in Saguaro Heights. I learned a lot from that whole experience. I learned that most people just want to be treated fairly, that bullies usually crumble when confronted, and that communities function better when they're based on mutual respect rather than fear. I learned that the law matters, even in mundane contexts like HOA disputes. And I learned that sometimes moving across the country to start over can lead you exactly where you need to be. These days, when I walk around the neighborhood, people wave and say hello. Kids ride their bikes past my house. Neighbors stop to chat about the weather, local politics, or whatever else is on their minds. It's normal, boring, suburban life, and it's exactly what I wanted. Well, maybe not boring. There was that incident with the neighbor who wanted to raise chickens, and the great Christmas decoration controversy of 2026. But those are stories for another time. The point is, I never thought a political sign would change my life. But it did. It brought me a community, gave me purpose, and reminded me why I chose to become a lawyer in the first place. Not for the big cases or the headlines, but for moments like these, helping ordinary people protect their rights against those who would take them away. And every election season, when I put up my political signs supporting whatever candidates I believe in, I remember that week in October 2025 when I moved to Scottsdale and immediately went to war with my HOA. Best decision I ever made.